Hi there, my name's James Kelly. Welcome back to Scott Goes Pop. It's been quite a 24 hours in politics with Angela Rayner resigning and with Ian Murray being sacked as Scottish Secretary and being replaced by Douglas Alexander. It's amazing, isn't it, the lack of importance we now give to the position of Scottish Secretary. I really had to think to remember whether Douglas Alexander had been Scottish Secretary before. My instinct was that he had been. Then I started questioning myself and I thought, well, am I just thinking of Danny Alexander? But no, it turns out that Douglas Alexander was Scottish Secretary as well in 2006 to 2007, I believe, which bodes well, in fact, because the SNP won an election at the end of that period. So hopefully the same thing will happen again. The wider reshuffle, it is said, has moved the Labour government to the right, which is almost unbelievable because in my opinion, Starmer had already taken Labour further to the right than it had never been, even under Tony Blair, it had never been at this right wing. So for it to go even further to the right, it's almost as if the idea is that they're saying to voters, you don't need to elect a reform government because you've already got one. And yet that theory isn't really working. Labour aren't getting any more popular. I don't think yet another shift to the right is going to make any difference, but we shall see. So I've written a couple of conventional blog posts about the cabinet reshuffle, about Ian Murray's departure, about Angela Rayner's departure. So if you'd like to read those, I might put a couple of links in the information section of this video. But in this video, I want to talk about a different subject because a couple of days ago, I received an email. Somebody was asking me for my opinion on an email he had sent to the First Minister, John Swinney, making two suggestions about completely different things. One is about reform of the Hollywood voting system, and the other one is about um, a change to the suggested change to the plan on independence. So because those are very different subjects, I will go through them separately because my reaction is different in each case. The first one, the electoral reform proposal. So Scotland's current additional member system uses the D'Hondt formula to allocate regional list seats, but this formula penalises parties that perform strongly in constituencies, effectively discounting tens of thousands of list votes. This undermines proportionality, creates voter frustration, and weakens Holyrood's democratic legitimacy. No, I don't agree with that because, well, it's simply not true. This undermines proportionality. The voting system is only proportional because the list seats are distributed on a compensatory basis. So if there's a disproportionality in the result among the constituency seats, which are almost always is, that's the nature of first past the post. That's then corrected by the use of the list seats. Now it's true that the way the list seats are distributed is not very intuitive, and therefore it frustrates people and it creates this impression of unfairness. But if you don't do that, then you don't have a proportional outcome. You don't have proportional representation. You're left with a system which is almost as disproportionate as first past the post itself. The proposal is I urge the SNP to commit to introducing a Scottish Parliament electoral reform bill in the next session that would replace the D'Hondt formula with single transferable vote for allocating regional list seats. Remove the penalty on parties winning constituencies, ensuring every list vote counts fully and equally. Retain first past the post for constituency MSPs to preserve local representation. Well, then you're going to end up with you basically abolish proportional representation. You don't get a proportional result. What you have is the very disproportionate first past the posts result, and you're topping that up with a proportional result, but it doesn't actually address the disproportionality of the first past the post element, and therefore the overall result is wildly disproportionate. But what I would agree with replacing the D'Hondt formula with single transferable vote, as long as you just do that across the board, as long as you just have a single STV system for all seats. And you don't therefore need first past the post. You don't need the constituency element if you've got STV, because STV has a constituency element. That's the whole beauty of STV. You have multi-member constituencies and you have a proportional outcome. So I think, it probably would be a good thing to replace the current system with STV, and it would get rid of that sort of counterintuitive element about the list system that people find so frustrating that creates the impression of unfairness, even though it isn't actually unfair. So it would get rid of that frustration. You would still have a proportional outcome, you would still have a constituency link of sorts, so it would tick most of the boxes. Or you could do what's happening in Wales, which is just go to a pure list system done on a regional basis, and then again you don't have the compensatory system where the lists are being distributed in a way that people can't understand, and you don't have all this nonsense about tactical voting on the list, which drives us all crazy. So I think that would be a good thing, and I think actually if I had to choose between the two, I think the pure list system that Wales is introducing is preferable actually to STV because it's possibly a little bit more proportional, although obviously the smaller number of seats you have per constituency, you're reducing the proportionality regardless of whether it's a pure list system or an STV system. But I think on the whole, I would prefer a pure list system because that's as proportional as you can get within those confines. So no, I don't agree with that proposal, other than the fact that STV is a good thing, but it's a complete nonsense to have STV and then still have a first past the post element, which is not being compensated for. That would leave us in the worst position. That would effectively abolish proportional representation for the Scottish Parliament. So the second element of the email, which is a completely different element, is about introducing a Let Scotland Decide bill early in the next Parliament, which I think is quite a clever name because it's addressing what John Swinney says he's trying to do about foregrounding Scotland's right to choose. But the proposal is to formally request a permanent Section 30 order from Westminster devolving to Holyrood the ongoing legal competence to legislate for independence referendums. If Westminster refuses or fails to respond, the bill would require Holyrood to vote on Scotland's right to decide. If two-thirds of MSP support that motion, the bill would trigger self-dissolution of the Scottish Parliament and call an early election, explicitly framed as a de facto referendum on Scotland's constitutional future. Well, yes, I think that's a perfectly reasonable idea because whatever the breaking of this logjam is, it probably is going to involve a de facto referendum. And I think it's one way of doing it is to, give Westminster the chance and then move forward to an early election. The exact sort of mechanism for this is open to discussion, and in this case, you're requiring two-thirds of MSPs to support the motion, which probably wouldn't pass. But that doesn't really matter actually, because it's pretty easy to engineer an early election if no government can be formed. Well, it depends on the arithmetic, of course, but if, say, the recent opinion polls are correct and the SNP are in a dominant position, it's not that difficult to do, because if the government resigns and no government can be formed, then there has to be an early election, regardless of whether there's a two-thirds majority in favour of that or not. And then as long as you move forward and make that a de facto referendum, then that all makes sense. But we know, of course, that the SNP leadership under John Swinney will not agree to any proposal like that. They completely set their face against any idea of using an election as a de facto referendum. Even though Nicola Sturgeon supported that, they have defined themselves by being opposed to that. They're completely wedded to the idea of imposing this insane supermajority requirement upon themselves, and saying that if the SNP could get to that sort of really high threshold of a single party overall majority, that would somehow break the logjam, and the UK government would be forced in terror or in awe to agree to a referendum because of the scale of this mandate, which is, well, highly unlikely the UK government would be moved in that way. But also, of course, it's highly unlikely that the SNP would actually achieve that mandate, because it is almost unachievable, particularly in the current circumstances. So why are they doing that? Well, I think the idea they've got in their mind is that if they say that to get to this threshold, for a mandate for an independence referendum that Westminster will not be able to say no to, you have to vote for the SNP rather than for the Green Party or for any other pro-independence party, then what may happen is that the SNP will not win an overall majority, but they might, say, kind of galvanise enough of the independent support behind them to get, say, maybe 54 seats where they might otherwise have got 50, or to get 58 seats where they might otherwise have got 54, or even to get maybe 61 where they might otherwise have got 57. And so it's getting the SNP into a much stronger position where they can govern with a stronger mandate, albeit on a minority basis. And it's you would then look back and think, well, that was worth doing. We're in a sort of stronger position than we were before. But what that's doing, of course, is using independence to get the SNP into a stronger position, whereas in fact, the whole purpose of the SNP's existence is supposed to be to deliver independence. And so there can never be a situation where, yeah, the SNP doing really well in an election is an end in itself. If you boost the SNP while damaging the cause of independence, which you would in this case, because if you fall short of the threshold, then you have, however strong a government you are, you have then effectively put independence off the agenda for the next 5 years, and then you've set a precedent which makes it very difficult for decades to come to get to the threshold that you've set yourself. And even if you go back on that, which of course we would have to go back on that, Westminster would still hold us to it and say, well, you've gone into elections saying you need an SNP overall majority. Why wouldn't that apply in future elections as well? So by setting that precedent, you're actually causing harm to the cause of independence. So if SNP success is causing harm to the cause of independence, then the whole exercise is a contradiction in terms. It just doesn't make any sense unless you've forgotten what the whole point of the SNP was in the first place. And the danger is we are going to lose sight of what the SNP is about and think it's about using independence to give power to the leadership of the SNP, whereas that's not the point. The point is to use the SNP as a lever, as our vehicle to win national independence. The moment at which we lose sight of that, which effectively we do if we endorse these John Swinney plan for independence unmodified, and I emphasize only if we do that unmodified, then we have basically lost the plot and we've lost our bearings and we are all at sea. It would take a long time to get back from that. So we have to, I think, use the upcoming SNP conference and try to take the harm away from this proposal. Even if people would sort of start scratching their heads and say, well, that's terrible that we've modified it and missed this opportunity to sort of coral support away from other pro-independence parties to the SNP. So what? It's about winning independence. It's not about winning seats for the SNP for its own sake. Normally, winning seats for the SNP is helpful for independence, but if you deliberately decouple that and make winning SNP seats harmful for the cause of independence, which I think is the first time that this would ever have happened, then that's a different matter entirely. Anyway, I'll just leave you with that to think about. That's it for now. If you're enjoying this content, please subscribe to my YouTube channel, and I'll see you later.